From the low desert, beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions. And one last time before he goes off to Prague for the rest of the summer, we have South Dakota Jack Hinrichs on. Jack, how are you doing? 48 hours to go until Prague. How are you handling it, the anticipation?
I'm so excited. I'm bouncing off the walls. It's going to be so much fun. I've got a lot of laundry to do between now and then. I have a vague idea of where my passport is, but I should probably have a more definite idea of where my passport is. But other than that, those are two pretty minor inconveniences. And then I'm going to be basking in the medieval charm and splendor of Prague.
I'm so jealous, man. What a great place to spend the rest of the summer. And then you're off to Florence. Well, you're
And then
back to South Dakota, and then you're off to Florence.
Well, I thought that it was important that I spend some time in a scenic location between the, gray, dull, dreary Prague and the gray, dull, dreary Florence, that I would go somewhere with majesty and splendor like Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It's a big metropolis of learning and culture, and I could think of nowhere better to spend 3 weeks.
Well, unlike in Prague, where the beautiful old buildings and the hills, and Florence, the hills will get in the way of you being able to see things. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, there's nothing blocking your view.
No, the pro is that you can see everything. The con, of course, is that there is nothing to see.
Well, you
And
might have, but you know what? If your dog's running away, you can watch it for 3 days.
that's true. Uh, it's a beautiful place for hunters because you can see every deer in a three-state area.
Yeah.
Uh, I recommend it. No, but seriously, my buddy Jack, who is a jazz guitar major at USC, he's one of America's most promising young jazz guitarists. He brought some of his friends, a guy from LA and a guy from New York, out to Sioux Falls. They were going to play a couple of gigs. And then Jack's family is originally from Winter, South Dakota. That's West River, South Dakota. That's ranching country. And so Jack brought him out to Winter, South Dakota. And for these kids from New York and LA who had always been hemmed in by the urban jungle, to be out in the great expanse, the Great Plains, where you can see for dozens and dozens and dozens of miles, where it's just a great expanse of prairie grass. It was shocking for them. It was such a psychological shift that apparently I wasn't there. This is from Jack's telling. It took them a few days just to become accustomed to nothing. And so if you're from a city, a real city, not Phoenix, and you're interested in having your world turned upside down a little bit, a good vacation to Winter, South Dakota, is something I would recommend.
Fair enough. Well, anyway, Jack, I know I speak for everybody when I say enjoy Prague. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity to spend several weeks there. And same thing with Florence. We'll have to live vicariously through you.
I'll send lots of pictures.
Good. All right. So before you run it away, there's been a bunch of news on the primary calendar, and that has been a kind of a focus and theme of our show for the year is the primary calendar. Um, and but I do want to kind of wrap a few of these things up for a while because I kind of want to go back a little bit to, over the next couple of weeks, we'll wrap it up. It won't just be this show, but I kind of want to go back to sort of the more structural analysis of politics, both historically and today. But there are a couple, but there are a few things I do want to touch on. First is and kind of some themes that we've been discussing. One, I'm going to start briefly in the UK. Nigel Farage has resigned his seat in Clatton, I think.
Yeah, Clacton or Clacton, I'm not
Yeah.
certain. Yeah,
Um,
I our country fought 250 years ago for the right to not know how to pronounce that word,
right.
and that's beautiful.
I might have I should have looked it up before I jumped on, but I think it's Clatton. Anyway, he resigned his seat. A couple of scandals are some financial scandals are kind of swirling. He's resigned it to basically have a by-election called, and he's going to contest it again. His point being that he said, given that this has come out, I owe it to the voters of this constituency to have their say. Um, and so he's doing that. He's going to run a very populist campaign there. And so that's kind of interesting. I don't know this is sort of a surprise, so I don't know, who his opponents are going to be other than Count Binface. Count Binface has announced. But other than him, I'm not sure who's jumping in. So that's kind of interesting. And the other piece of news is that a certain Maine Senate candidate has decided that he is going to take some time to figure out what his next step is. And this is a bit of a victory lap for Jack and I because, frankly, we've been on this maybe before anybody else outside of Maine. We were on this back end of last year as to what a potential disaster Graham Platner would be for the Democratic Party and his unique awfulness. But Jack, anyway, you want to? I'll let you jump in here on Mr. Platner.
Yeah, I feel that it is not going too far to say that Graham Platner's political career is over. Um, it's been frankly ridiculous to read so many statements from leftist liberal Democrats who supported Graham Platner, supported him at the beginning, supported him through the Nazi tattoo, supported him through the text message scandal, supported him through the recent Politico and New York Times reports about his behaviors and relationships. Now turn around and put out statements saying that this is a bridge too far and that they can no longer support him. Um, Rob and I have spent the last 6 months saying that this is clearly a man who has some issues, who has a history of being disrespectful towards women, who has a history of uh, demeaning and appalling conduct, in saying if this is what we know in April or March or June, what is there that's going to come out closer to the election? And for these leftist figures to now try to shed Platner without reckoning with how they got to this point, without reckoning why they were able to put up with so much for so long, to just sort of divest themselves of him is embarrassing. And I think that the left wing of the Democratic Party has to have a real a period of soul searching for how they were so taken in by Graham Platner and why they were willing to overlook and obfuscate so many of his deficiencies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that says it very well. I don't want to get into the actual claims here.
They're
People, you're either
disgusting.
aware, yeah, they're disgusting. People are either aware of them or you can find them other places. But I will just say, for those who continue to defend or continue to say things like, oh well, no, Paul, there's know, nobody's going to be in politics. No ordinary people are going to be in politics if we don't demand, if we demand that they be saints. Like, you know what? If this was behavior that Plattner had engaged in 2002, like Plattner's a little older than me. I'm 39. If Plattner had been engaged in this, had a couple of, let's just say, judgment missteps, to put it very, very lightly, back in 2004, 2005, 2006, you know what? There's lots of time to recover from that. People do dumb things when they're in their late teens and early 20s. There's still no excuse for this behavior. But at the same time, if there'd been a couple of bad judgment calls back then, there might be an opportunity for, to say, okay, yeah, I mean, we all become different people, even if it had been 10, 15 years ago. But this is 2021. I'm younger than Graham Plattner. You know what I was doing in 2021? I was raising my daughter. I was there with my wife in the hospital, making sure that my daughter was okay. I was worried about that. I by no means am a perfect person. In fact, I'm pretty far from one. But even I, by 2021, who's younger than Graham Platner, was at a point in my life where I was just like in full on family mode. Whereas Graham Platner was engaging in these, salacious rendezvous. And anyway,
Yeah.
not much else to say
And
there.
and and these allegations are so far beyond the pale. Like, here's the thing.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's not
Like,
even. Yeah.
yeah, I'm a student at Arizona State University, a college student at Arizona State University. I've seen over the past few years a lot of people who are fundamentally decent people do some stupid stuff because because of their age and in the circumstance and the context. Like but it is commendable for those people a few years later to come out the other side and have grown as a person and to apologize, and to become better in the future. But for him to be doing these things, as you said, well into his maturity,
Mid
like
30s.
yeah, as a mid 30s, as an individual in his mid 30s, is ridiculous. And I just keep going back to the notion that the Democratic Party, especially the left wing of the Democratic Party, proclaims loudly that it stands up for the marginalized, it stands up for the voiceless, it stands up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. And in some cases, you can argue that they do, in fact, do that. I'm not here to indict the entire policy proposals of the left wing of the Democratic Party or every individual on that wing. But in this case,
That's my job.
yeah, that's Rob's job. But in this case, to to proclaim that you stand up for the marginalized and the voiceless and yet continue backing a man who has such a clear and blatant record of not only insensitivity, of not only poor judgment, but of disrespect towards women, both in relationships and while he is in a relationship, I just don't that there is a clear, not just a paradox there, but there is a clear hypocrisy there. And the left wing of the Democratic Party needs to think about why they were so willing to back somebody who might share the ideals that they proclaim, but fails to live up those ideals in such a dramatic way.
Yeah. All right. You think Plattner's done? I'm not so sure. Things are weird. You mentioned that the Senate committee has withdrawn their funding. Is that correct?
Yes, Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, who are respectively the Senate Majority Leader, and Kirsten Gillibrand's the head of the SEC. I believe at this moment, I'm like 98% sure, put out a statement in which they said that if Graham Platner remained the nominee, the DSCC would invest no money in the race. I think that if Graham Platner still had the money, he might continue to venture forward. But without DSCC financial involvement, there's simply no way to run a viable campaign. Putting aside the scandals, just from a funding standpoint, like if the money is not there, you can be the nominee or not, but functionally you're not running for Senate. And so in this case, I do think that Graham Platner, if only because of the funding, is going to accept that he has to drop out. I hope so. If he doesn't, uh, then if he doesn't before Monday, and I suppose we should give the timeline here. Maine law says that so long as a party's nominee drops out, in this case, before July, shoot, now I'm forgetting the date, but
13th.
it's next Monday, 13th, thank you. July 13th, which is next Monday, the state commit or the state party can appoint a new candidate. Um, Neither Maine law nor the bylaws of the Maine Democratic Party lay out the process for that selection. According to a New York Times reporting, the Maine Democratic Party has opted to not select it via an elite process. We might call that the Kamala Harris coronation form of nomination. but rather to have impromptu party caucuses to quickly select a nominee around the state. But if Graham Platner were to drop out before 5 p.m. on Monday, July 13th, the main Democratic Party can pick a nominee. If Graham Platner waits past 5 p.m. on Monday, July 13th, then short of death or serious injury, his name's on the ballot. And there is nothing you can do about that.
It's interesting. See how this plays out. There's a lot going to go into this main election. We'll shelve it for another time. I want to talk about how this might have, you know, this decision, however it goes, might create a schism within the main Democratic electorate, no matter how it goes at this point. So there, anyway, lots to discuss down the road. But I do want to get to the real purpose, the real thing I wanted to talk about. Um, and my pivot to that is going to be, how does this affect Bernie Sanders?
That's a fantastic question. I think that's the $10,000 question. Before we launch into an answer on it, I think it's important to note that Bernie Sanders sort of went out on a limb in endorsing Graham Platner as early and as vocally as he did. Other prominent figures on the American left, like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, for example, did not endorse Graham Platner, did not support Graham Platner. And so this
That's important. I want to go back to that for a second. That's important. AOC didn't has not campaigned for Platner or endorsed Platner, correct?
AOC has not, to my knowledge, endorsed or campaigned for Graham Platner.
At least
And
prominently.
so,
Maybe by default at some point, especially once he got the nomination. But
mhm.
I don't certainly not before that.
No. And that stands in contrast to AOC being a vocal proponent of other left-wing Democratic candidates like Dr. Abdul El Sayed in Michigan, for example, where AOC is a vocal supporter. And so this is specifically a Bernie Sanders issue or mistake. Mistake, I suppose, implies a level of it being an accident. A Bernie Sanders problem. And so I do think that it diminishes his credibility within not just the left wing of the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party as a whole, in a situation where otherwise Bernie Sanders would seem to be building up some institutional support and power within the Democratic Party, given all of the very progressive populist Sandersite figures who are winning primaries. Um, this is a very serious blotch on his otherwise I don't want to say sterling record, but record of success.
It also happened in his backyard. It's one thing if this had happened, let's say, in Oregon or out west or in the South or something like that, even the Midwest. This happened in his backyard. So it's even more of a damning indictment, I think, on his judgment.
And like Bernie Sanders, and I mean I don't know anything about Bernie Sanders's internal monologue or psychology. I can't tell you why he chose to back Platner. Um, but it very seriously calls his judgment into question in a moment where the left wing of the Democratic Party, and this gets back to the institutional or structural questions that we want to address, the left wing of the Democratic Party has seen some pretty dazzling success in primaries over the past year and specifically within the past month and a half or so. And for such an ascendant wing, it is important, in my opinion, to have a figurehead, a leader, a spokesman, a person that people can trust and people can turn to, who can settle internal squabbles, who can direct strategy and messaging, who can be the public face. And Bernie Sanders, sort of by default, would have been that public face. He is the eminent member of that wing of the party, and this Plattner debacle um, very much, in my opinion, jeopardizes that role for him and destabilizes his eminence and his influence within the Democratic Party. And that has some structural questions for the left wing of the Democratic Party, i.e., if not Sanders, then who?
Yeah. All right. I'm going to criticize Sanders here for a minute.
Okay.
Um, One of the things that I really deeply distrust about Bernie Sanders is he surrounded himself by people 3 generations younger than him. That's a bad reflection on you as a person, by the way. For anybody out there who is an older person who it's one thing to hire people who are younger than you. It's one thing to socialize with people who are younger than you. But it's another thing to lead a movement where you are the geriatric and everybody else is like 40 or 50 years younger than you. I, in the last episode where we talked about Platner, the literary illusion I used was Raskolnikov for Platner. I'm changing it a little bit to suit my purposes today. The Sanders gang um, reminds me of Fagin in Oliver Twist. He was reminding me of Fagin from Oliver Twist. Now there's some I recognize that people might think that I'm making some anti-Semitic connection there. I'm not. The archetype is the fact of an older person who surrounds himself by younger people because he can control the younger people, because he can manipulate them. I wouldn't have said that about Bernie Sanders until this year, but he's starting to emerge as this Fagin-like figure. In which case, if we're changing it from Dostoevsky to Charles Dickens, Platner becomes Bill Sykes rather than Raskolnikov. Um, but I'm still content to
Yeah.
leave him where he was before. But my point is that you've got this little young gang of people, the judgment of which is sort of up in the air, and the moral authority is very up in the air. And you have a guy who's at the center of it who cannot be president. We don't think Bernie Sanders can be president anymore. His chance was maybe in 2020. It's not in 2028. He's too old. But he's this central figure of a movement that is reminding me of to a certain degree, reminds me of the Fagin gang in Oliver Twist. And, in this sense, and in my illusion, or these literary choices, the other really important figure is not Fagin, but the Artful Dodger, and that's Zohran Mamdani.
You've put a lot of thought into this.
I have, I have.
Yeah. I think that in bearing in mind that on that last Plattner episode on YouTube specifically, we received a number of comments critiquing and adjusting our literary analyses, and so I'll be curious to see what those individuals think of Rob's current proposal. I think it's worth noting before we jump to Mamdani and his machine in New York that Bernie Sanders has a long record of being a pretty lousy, or of hiring some pretty lousy people. Um, if you look back on his 2016 campaign staff, and what those folks have gone on to do and say on social media and what they've gone on to support, um, it's checkered, to say the least. I'm going to put it delicately by saying it's checkered. And so when Rob and I talk about Bernie Sanders being a doubtful judge of character in the Graham Plattner situation, I think it's important to note that that is by no means a new phenomenon. Bernie Sanders has long surrounded himself by people of um, questionable questionable decision making authority, or questionable, um, I don't know what the verb is I'm looking for, discernment. There it was. And so that's by no means a new thing. Um, Mamdani, pardon me, on the other hand, is an interesting case, uh, because while Sanders' star is falling and Plattner's star is certainly falling, Mamdani's is on the rise, I would argue.
Yeah, but Mamdani, of course, is probably more responsible for Plattner than Sanders.
Yeah,
But
certainly.
he's the young guy. He can kind of get away with a lapse in judgment. You're Bernie Sanders. You're in your 80s. You can't get away with it. You can't be simultaneously the elder statesman and naive.
No, you can't. And Mamdani, by virtue of both running that campaign for mayor and being mayor, has the obvious out. Look, I was busy being mayor. Um,
I
Now that
outsourced this.
investment,
I
yeah,
outsourced the vetting. I outsourced a lot of the stuff, and I'm the mayor of the most important city in the world. Agreed. Like he'll survive this in a way that I don't know that Sanders should. Um, but anyway, just reinforcing my point. Don't trust older people who are running a gang of younger people, much younger people. There's a reason for that. It's because he can't find anybody else who's his age who will agree with him or who will do as he says.
and
And and and in the end, this is and here's the literary aspect again that's worth remembering. When Fagin is about to be hanged, Oliver Twist visits him, right, in jail. And Fagin gives a monologue where he blames everybody else but himself. And, Charles Dickens was as much of a critic of the industrial order as you're likely to find. But one of the things that Dickens makes clear is this moral, that one of the things that that there will be that your environment, your external circumstances are no justification for moral failing. And I just
and
think
tune
that
in.
in sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to joke and tune in next week for when we cast Kansas Governor Laura Kelly in Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita.
Yeah. Uh, I don't know where this. It must be summertime. I'm having these weird flashes. I'm not even a literature guy. I don't know where this is coming from. Anyway, so I'm psychoanalyzing people, such as life. Anyway, but Zoran Mamdani, the Artful Dodger, who uh, who might actually really embrace that nickname if he were
Yeah.
to hear it. He's had a pretty good few weeks, aside from the Platner debacle. He's had a pretty good few weeks. So, Jack, what happened in New York? It was big news, but it was a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's worth talking a little bit about.
Yeah, the New York primaries were a couple of weeks ago now. New York State, we should say. And for both Congress and for the state legislature, there were a number of races in which establishment figures, either incumbents or backed by retiring incumbents, longtime Democrats, people who are well known in the community, had been in politics for decades, were defeated by Mamdani-backed, progressive, DSA-affiliated um, candidates. And this happened notably in three congressional races. You had two incumbents defeated, including the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and also in a number of New York State Senate and State Assembly races. You had DSA-backed candidates and Mamdani-backed candidates fend off establishment figures. And then, yeah, it's been a good week or a good month, pardon me, for the Mamdani machine.
Yeah, it's very impressive, frankly, electorally. Now, the people who he's gotten elected are pretty impressive, but they knocked off some very high profile people. Um, the one who's gotten most of the attention, Chevalier, is that her last name? Yeah, she was highly involved in the Gaza Columbia protests, and yeah, and has sort of and has been making the rounds on a lot of on a lot of media outlets, and has sort of become the face of this particular. And she was the one who knocked off the chair of the Hispanic Caucus. Um, Sort of become the face of these little Mamdanis.
Mhm. And I think it's important to note that these congressional districts in New York City, and then also when we talk about in Denver, and that congressional
Mhm.
upset, primary upset, these are not only are these not competitive races, these are not within the realm of anything that could be competitive. These are D plus 30 to the Denver congressional seat that we'll talk about in a moment is a D plus 56 congressional seat. So these are about as democratic as a congressional seat can get. And so it's not I think that that's important to note because dynamics within politically uncompetitive constituencies can be different than dynamics within politically competitive constituencies. But it is notable, I think, that Chevalier, who is the most prominent and has the record of saying the or having the most what would be a good adjective for her statements, provocative statements, um, had both the toughest lift in that she was polling. She was not expected to win that race. That was an upset. The polling did not indicate that she was going to win that race. The incumbent she was facing, the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, had been in Congress for a very long time, had been involved in local politics for a very long time, very esteemed individual. He was a formidable incumbent, and she, despite having the most provocative public statements and public attitude, was able to defeat him. And I do think that it's notable that the most provocative primary challenger defeated the most formidable incumbent.
Yeah, and again, this is not a person who is saying anything of considerable substance either. She's being provocative, but not even being interestingly provocative. It's the it's the sloppulous kind of framing that's been used for this stuff. But Mamdani has thrown his weight around very impressively. And so, Jack, how is it? You're a Democrat. Explain this to me. How is it that she was able to do this? And that Mamdani's machine was able to accomplish, especially in this high profile congressional race?
There is an incredible amount of dissatisfaction, anger, impatience, feelings of being disrespected within the core of the Democratic Party, the sort of folks who show up to vote for a primary in June, um, who feel that the Democratic Party has for too long been ruled by older, moderate figures who are too conciliatory, who come from an earlier era of politics, who are they perceive them as being too neoliberal in their economic politics, and as being too unwilling to take on Donald Trump. And this was really ignited in 2024 when the Biden debacle that Rob and I have discussed at length on this podcast um, showed that the establishment figures in the Democratic Party, the powers that be within the apparatus, were uh, were not didn't have the stomach to stand up for political gain or for their or to achieve their political ends. They didn't have the stomach to stand up for Biden. They didn't have the stomach to stand up to a Harris coronation, and now they don't have the stomach to properly stand up to what they perceive as abuses by the Trump administration. And so what we're seeing in these primaries is the venting of that anger and the venting of that dissatisfaction. And so it almost becomes a situation in which the particular incumbent, their name, their record, their history, their voting tendencies do not matter. The figures that are being knocked off in these Democratic parties, I'll use Representative Espelot as an example, who was knocked off the by Chevalier, is not a right-wing Democrat by any stretch of the imagination. Is not Has voted to impeach Trump a number of times. Has supported Democratic policy priorities. So these are not right-wing quote unquote Democrats that are being beaten, but rather this is a throw the bums out sentiment, and whoever happens to be an incumbent is the bum. Um, and so, yeah, what you're seeing is a venting of anger.
We're in the process of, I think, just structurally a major party like a major electoral realignment, right? And we saw that on the Republican and kind of between 2016 and 2024, and we're seeing it now on the Democratic side of things. Um, and it is pretty remarkable. Although, I mean, I must say, Jack, I don't disagree that sentiment is there, what you just explained to me. But all of the messaging I see is about Israel or billionaires. It's billionaires. It's not even neoliberalism anymore. It's just billionaires in Israel.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder to what degree, um, I know that there are any number of Democrats and progressives who genuinely feel that Israel has abused their position, that Israel has done wrong in this conflict. And I don't want to demean the sincerity of the rank and file's beliefs. However, I do think it's notable that the period in which this progressive wave really took off, the period in which the kerosene was ignited, coincides with October 7th and the bring and when this conflict was brought to the front page. I wonder sometimes which is the chicken and which is the egg. If the progressives were coming to power anyway and they seized on October 7th and the Israel-Palestine conflict as a handy dividing line between progressive Democrats and establishment Democrats, or if the Israel-Palestine conflict in some way contributed to the rise of progressivism. And to a degree, it's both, I'm sure. But I do think it's notable that there's been a conflict between Israel and Palestine for well on 50 years now. Senator Jim Abourezk, senator from South Dakota, the first Arab American to serve in the U.S. Senate, was discussing this conflict and inveighing from a progressive standpoint against Israel in the mid 70s. And it is really only today that it has become such a high profile issue within progressive circles. And given that, I wonder if it's not if it wasn't opportunely timed, if it wasn't seized upon as being a nice dividing line. And
Yeah,
again, I don't want to, and I know that there are many progressives who deeply feel this, and I don't want to demean the depth to which they care about this issue. I am talking again about elite figures within the progressive space who are in some way setting the agenda.
yeah. I mean, you're right. This is a major issue that goes, American feelings on and divisions over this go a long way back. I mean, let's not forget that Robert Kennedy Sr. was killed by Sirhan because Robert Kennedy supported Israel. Um, and so, this is an issue that is a live wire issue going a long way back. I do think that that this issue was in the background in the 20 teens when a lot of Gen Z came to political consciousness, for instance, like around Donald Trump and around climate change and other issues. And this issue was huge when I was young, around the era of the Second Intifada, and then the Israel-Lebanon war that began in 2006. So I mean, this was front and center when I was younger. But for a lot of people, when they were coming to political consciousness, this had receded to the back pages and was not a frontline issue. And then October 7th happens. I think a lot of well-meaning Americans are confused. But it also fits neatly into the settler colonial imperialist uh, framework that they've all adapted in other worlds, not specifically for this, but in other thinking about in other contexts. And so it neatly fit into that. Of course, again, what launches this entire thing is a brutal and vicious attack by Hamas on innocent Israelis, the brutality of which I still don't think people have come to terms with or even recognize. And say what you want, people can say what they want. There's obviously going to be significant amounts of disagreement on the Israeli response, both in Gaza and then in the West Bank, but and Lebanon. But there's um, it's an issue that I just, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
this is the issue that has created a major emotional response in people. I think that there's political organizations out there who are very good at social media who have established a very sincere emotional response in people that young people were poorly equipped to deal with.
and our listeners will recognize how carefully Rob and I are choosing our words here, because this is such an evocative issue. Um, and there has been an immense amount of pain and suffering and death in Gaza that has, as Rob said, been broadcasted out on social media, and worked its way into algorithms. And I would again cite how social media companies and their algorithms are specifically designed to feed enraging content, embittering content, to people, to hook them, to keep them on the site, to drive their most primal emotional responses. And so in some ways it's a perfect storm of distressing content being created and then plugged into a machine uniquely suited to inflame passions with that content. What I would say is, in 2012, to go back to your earlier point, if you'd asked a Democratic primary voter, where does the Israel-Palestine conflict rank on your list of priorities? I imagine, and you can disagree with me, Rob. I wasn't voting in 2012, of course. But I imagine it would have been, I don't know, eighth, ninth, 10th place, maybe a little higher than that. And so I think that it is notable to see how much it has been driven to the forefront. And there have been it's such a colossal issue. It's such a provocative issue. And I think that an important part of the discussion needs to be how the social media apparatus, which is utilized to a great extent by Gen Z to get their news and their entertainment, is specifically designed use this exact sort of content to inflame passions. We're not just talking about, we've talked about political elites and progressive elites here. We also need to talk about social media elites and their role in spreading this issue.
Well, I mean, and let's be real. The platform that this spread the most on was TikTok. And who are the social media elites when we're talking about TikTok? Right? They're not American. They're not Western. They're China. The connect. While the connections between TikTok, ByteDance, and the Chinese Communist Party are not always easy to ascertain, um, it has been that was the platform that saw this spread the most like wildfire. To answer your 2012 thing, I think there was just a general consensus in the United States on the Israel-Palestine issue going back to the Oslo Accords that a two-state solution was desirable. And in fact, that was generally the feeling in Israel and with the PLO even. That a two-state solution was desirable. Now, what that meant was very different to everybody, but generally everybody can say what it means and how to get there. There was a lot of disagreement over, but generally, I think most people, whether they were an arch Republican in the United States and an arch, most progressives in the United States, most people in Israel, and even people at least in the West Bank leadership, generally thought that a two-state solution was desirable. And again, huge amounts of disagreement on what that actually means. But that consensus was blown apart on October 7th. And so, it's so. And I think what happened in Israel is there was loud noises that maybe a two-state solution is no longer desirable, and in the progressive left across the world, there was a view that you're right, maybe a two-state solution is not desirable. And what they mean by that are the opposite of things. And so that kind of, I can't think of the word for it, but that was the consensus that I think had kind of kept this issue, at least within the realm of decent politics, I guess, until it was removed. But anyway, I brought that up because I just think that this seems to be the emotional issue at the heart of this left wing populist rise that's being associated with Mamdani. Now, Jack, can you think of anywhere else in the United States? New York sort of has this history of New York City has a history of machine politics, right? Especially in the Democratic Party, going back to Tammany Hall. Um, you
Well,
know,
in the Albany Regency, it's where
Well, the
machine
Albany,
politics.
well, the Albany Regency, then the Albany Ring. I mean, New York is kind of, and then look at Atlantic City, right? There was political machines, in Atlanta, right? Kasim Reed ran a political machine until he retired, and the current Democratic nominee for governor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, took over and kind of blew that machine to smithereens. But can we talk a little bit about machine politics?
It's such a fascinating topic. I think that Americans often overlook machine politics because they're not as prominent anymore. Maybe they're not called political machines. It's seen as a relic of the past. And in doing so, we forget how ubiquitous they used to be. They weren't just in Atlanta and in New York City and Atlantic City. There was a political machine in Sioux Falls, South Dakota between, about 1895 and 1920. Mayor George Burnside ran a Republican political machine in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, population like, I don't know, 30,000 people. And so, uh, but because we don't call them that really anymore, uh, they are sort of overlooked. I think it's notable, and we're talking about the Mamdani machine in the history of machine politics. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. That there had been a longtime reformist activity within both parties, but I would argue specifically within a progressive wing of both parties, uniting both reformist Democrats and then also progressive Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt or George Norris, other figures, um, to advocate against political machines, to sort of devolve power to the people via open primaries, secret ballots, other like reforms. And yet the Mamdani machine is a firmly progressive political machine. And so I'm curious to hear what you have to say specifically about the history of progressive political machinery.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think progressivism, when we think of it as a historical phenomenon, when we talk about progressivism today and we talk about progressivism historically, we do it in a little bit of a slippery fashion because I mean I think that what it means to be progressive today is in a lot of ways very distinct from what it means to be a progressivist or a progressive historically in the United States. I mean I think there are a couple of uniting factors in progressivism. One is belief in elites, that there is sort of a non-political elite way of doing things, that if only we give the elites the resources and the political power with which to enact change, they will solve our dearest and most challenging social problems. So that could have been, cholera, could have been tuberculosis, could have been disease related, could be climate change related. And so, I mean, I think that, you want to look at, COVID would probably be the best modern example, or climate change would be the best modern example of big social problems that progressives kind of continued in that tradition of trust the experts. We need to empower the experts. We give them the resources. If we give the experts enough resources, they will solve the problem. If we give them the resources and we all listen to them, we will solve the problem. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of continuity between progressives at the turn of the last century and progressives today. And in fact, I'd argue that we're moving out. The group that we're calling progressives is maybe not even progressive in that way anymore. We're not hearing trust the experts out of the Mamdani machine, are we? We're not hearing trust the experts out of Graham Platner or Bernie Sanders. This is a populist force. James Tallarico might be a progressive, but the forces that we've been talking about so far on this are populist. They're not progressive. And so I think that's actually the major, you mentioned earlier that there's this like neoliberal notion that there are very few Clintonite neoliberals or true neoliberals in the Democratic Party anymore. There's a few, but they're mostly gone. The reality is the establishment are progressive in the Democratic Party. If we are to take about like a longue durée perspective on what these ideologies actually mean, and the insurgents are populist. However, they don't really like the name populist because they think that has like a negative connotation that they're trying to put on the Trump figures. But in some ways, they've got more in common with William Jennings Bryan than they do with Herbert Crowley or Jane Addams. Whereas, like the Jane Addams wing is is Chuck Schumer. So that was actually
William.
a weird. That didn't touch on machine politics at all. I'm sorry. I got off track. I'm going to come back to machine politics here. Then I'll let you jump in, Jack. So the reason I went on that long detour, which I've now remembered why I went on that long detour, was because machine politics is not. There's a notion that progressives want to clean up politics. And I think that was true at one time. That was a uniting thing, but I don't think that's been true now and forever. That's a thing that's true across time. I think people want power, whatever their ideology is. They want power, and they will use whatever mechanism they can in order to achieve it. So I don't think that there's anything necessarily contradictory about a progressive political machine.
And before I talk about that, I think that's a really interesting response. About William Jennings Bryan, there is a historical basis for our literary analyses. The Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz is, of course, William Jennings Bryan. L. Frank Baum, South Dakotan, The Wizard of Oz is a political commentary about that. So it's not just us, folks. Other people do it too. Um, But no, I appreciate that distinction. I think that I agree that it's important to draw the differences between the two. Um, I do think it's fascinating. I was wondering, Rob, if you could talk a little bit about right-wing populism in the uh, what you might call the progressive era, or 1880s to 1920s, because as you mentioned, there is a significant amount of right-wing populism that is occurring today that is confusing the terms, and yet we don't talk about right-wing populism from that area very often. And so, for my own information, more than anything else, I'm interested if you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, well, this is my sweet spot. So you've asked a good question here. So it's really hard to put wings on political movements to say this is right or this is left in the era of really between 1890 and 1936. Okay, which is really the era that we're talking about here. Political scientists have referred to this as the fourth party system, where you have basically Republican dominance, and it's Republican dominance of the really the eastern, like the Northeast and the Midwest, uh, have are basically national elections. Republicans have a monopoly on those areas, with the only two exceptions being 1912 and 1916. Um, and they essentially control it, and they use that to make sure they control the House, the Senate, and the White House. I think they have control in the 36 years between 96 and 2032. They have unified control in 24 of them, 24 of those years, the Republican Party. So it's a dominant. Um, so that's sort of the characteristics of the system. the popu- the system emerges really as a response to the populists led by William Jennings Bryan, most famously, when they capture the Democratic Party. So that's kind of what establishes this hegemony, is this, or this hegemony, or however you pronounce it, is it's a response to the threat to the system, to what's viewed as the industrial system that's represented by William Jennings Bryan. And so they coalesce control around the other party and basically keep the other party away from office. It's way more complicated than that. The South plays a major role. Um, when we're talking about when we're talking about populism, typically we're associating that with the rural agrarian uprising against the industrial system. But there are other populist forces at work. And again, I hesitate to call them right wing or left wing because you don't really, there's, would you define the right versus the left in this period? I don't know how you would actually do it. Um, but so, people have typically associate William Jennings Bryan with the left, but I mean, he was also an arch prohibitionist. He,
Religious fundamentalist.
Roland's fundamental, he was a believer in true Jeffersonianism in a lot of ways. He had his own take on what that actually meant, but he sort of believed in this power of producerism, which in some ways is a right wing notion. It's not a left wing notion. He didn't want power to concentrate at the center, which you could argue in some ways, and some on the right prefer that. So it's a really difficult kind of distinction to make. But there are other populist forces, particularly in the that we can distinguish from William Jennings Bryan's forces, and they're prominent in the Northeast, which is Republican country at the time. People like groups like the Ku Klux Klan are really big in the northeastern United States. There's a major anti-immigration fervor that elites are involved in too. Although it sounds like it's populist, but it's like so it's and the Ku Klux Klan. This is the second Ku Klux Klan, not the first Ku Klux Klan. The second Ku Klux Klan is in some ways eerily reminiscent of the Orange Order. They're not. They're in fact they've got more in common with the Orange Order than they do with like the the Reconstruction Ku Klux Klan, or the Ku Klux Klan that reemerges in the South. In fact, there's actually a few branches of the Ku Klux Klan that try to make themselves open to black members because they're like, well, our problem isn't black people, it's Catholics, right? So this is a very it is a populist moment, and then you also see support for prohibition. But support for prohibition is not populist; it's both populist and progressive. There's a lot of progressives who want prohibition too because they believe that it'll solve a lot of social problems. Um, the anti-Catholic side of it is probably a little more populist, but even progressives are pretty can often be anti-Catholic. So it's difficult to say, but it's distinguishable generally, I think, populism from progressivism in this period is that populism is an aggressive movement to take power away, take take political power away from the economic elites. Whereas progressivism is a way to sort of just make it not corrupt, if that makes sense.
That
It's
does
not,
make sense.
yeah,
I think that's a good clarification. And so then how do political machines factor into that?
yeah. Political machines are there. There are political machines that, like Tammany Hall, is arguably progressive. In the Tammany Hall is like in some ways, uh, is a bête noire of progressives. They point to Tammany Hall. They're like, look at how corrupt Tammany Hall is. But Tammany Hall will turn around and go, look how we're cleaning up government. Right?
Yep.
So it's it is quite interesting. So I guess my point is, again, coming back to the point that progressives, for their own political perspective, often pointed to political machines, cleaning up government, that kind of thing. But it never stopped them from establishing their own machines if it suited them.
Yeah. It's yeah, and now we do see that with Mamdani, and certainly his politics are very different than the politics of a William Jennings Bryan or of a Tammany Hall member. Um,
Al
but
Smith. He's not Al Smith.
no, no, he's not Al Smith, is he? Uh, and yet you do see that there are certain consistencies that you can draw with that sort of distrust of elites, as you cite. Um, that's definitely a current or a message that is shared not just by Mamdani, but also AOC and Bernie Sanders and so on and so forth. And so I wonder, Rob, as Mamdani becomes an elite himself, as mayor of New York, as a prominent political figure, and also an elite within his machine, how do you think that fares for the future of his anti-elite political movement?
It's always difficult when you run yourself as an anti-elite and then you become an elite. You've got to keep inventing elites to run against. It's why oftentimes populism peters out after a while, or one of the reasons why it tends to peter out after a while. It, I'm I am curious how that happens. You know, as long as Chuck Schumer is still around, he gives somebody to run against. He gives somebody to be the face of what you're running against within the Democratic Party. Um, but here's the thing: is that even once takes control of the Democratic Party, or if he does manage to take control of the Democratic Party, he can then go right ahead and just say, well, the elites are the Republicans, right? And so, oh, look at the crypto billionaires, look at the billionaires and, around the Republican Party. Yeah, we got rid of them in the Democratic Party. They went fleeing to the Republican Party. And so, um, and what's going to happen, of course, is I think what you're going to see is you're going to see the Republican Party running a populist campaign, complaining about the elites, the academic, journalist, cultural elites that are surrounding Zohran Mamdani and whoever the Democratic nominee is in 2028. And the Democratic Party is going to say, look at all the economic elites that are around whoever the Republican nominee is in 2028. And they're both going to be running populist campaigns against different elites.
Uh, yeah, as proud members of the liberal academic intelligentsia elite here at the Politics in the Past Desert Dialogues podcast.
Well, I don't know about
Um,
that. You can call yourself whatever you want, but
nope, we're in this together, Rob.
no,
Can't get out of it now.
no, no. I mean, my my perspective is my own bearing is independent of virtually all of that. Um, as befits somebody who's trying to just analyze as opposed to have a team that I play. Maybe there's my
It's what
elitism.
such
There's
a
my
great
elite.
host.
There's my elitism coming through. But um, it is. I think that's what we're at. We're at a period where both parties are consumed by are going to be have populist messages. Um, and I think it's I don't know, but I think that's where we're at because it is. And now here's the thing: the Democrats have been running against the elites since Andrew Jackson, right? And baby Thomas Jefferson, and it's they have oftentimes represented the elites, right? That's never been a barrier to them running against elites. So Zohran Mamdani will, Mamdani of course can't run for president. He wasn't born in the United States, was he? No. And that's actually an interesting thing. Is the two people that we've talked about the most on this show, Bernie Sanders is probably disqualified from being president because of his age,
Yeah,
and Zohran Mamdani is legally disqualified from being president. So both of these guys who are leading these major populist left-wing forces, neither one of which is going to be the leader.
yeah. It's an interesting predicament that the Democratic Party finds itself in, and 2028
Yeah,
predictions, of course, are their own podcast.
yeah, that's exactly.
Um,
But anyway, Jack, I want to get back to machine politics for a second. We are running out of time, and we didn't talk anywhere near as much about machine politics as I'd hoped to. But I am curious, why is it? Do you think in urban areas, they're typically considered an urban phenomenon, but are they a rural phenomenon too?
that's an interesting question. I would say that they are a rural phenomenon um, to a certain extent. If you think of a machine as being more than just a political organization, because, and my understanding of this, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that machines like Tammany Hall functioned almost like benevolent organizations,
They
where the
could.
machine was only, this is who you're going to vote for, but this is who you should approach about getting a job, and this is who you should approach if you need, a little welfare, or if you've got a widow or an orphan in the machine. And you do see some of that within rural areas, both historically and today. Um, I do think that there is an extent to which just the diffuse nature of rural areas defeats some of the machine elements. It's hard to so totally control politics if, for a practical matter, you have to drive 400 miles to the next population center. It makes that level, that distance allows for more independence of thought, perhaps.
Perhaps. I mean, I,
Uh,
I, I, I think that they exist in rural areas too. We have the big man rings, the phenomenon of that, like local big men. Those
oh,
are
absolutely.
oftentimes the equivalent of political machines. They just look a little bit different. They're almost
Yeah,
more
just not
person.
on the same scale. Yeah.
They're almost more personalized. Um, whereas in now machines can be personalized too. Look at Crump in Memphis, Nucky in Atlantic City. Again, those are the examples that are leaping to mind right now. I guess I watched Boardwalk Empire not too long ago. I guess that's why it's in my head. But it is this. We sort of think that they're not a big part of politics anymore, but they are. They just look different. They're a little more hidden. And I think in New York City, what you're seeing is the former regime, whatever that looked like, is being Mamdani has launched his assault against it. And it might not just be in New York City; it might be a New York State regime, Democratic regime. Um, so it's a, but I mean, but also we didn't talk about Colorado, but he's having an effect around the country.
He is, absolutely. He is a disruptor, to be sure, all across the nation.
You
It'll
know
be.
what? The Spurs owed it to us to win those games in order to make sure that this wouldn't happen.
I wonder how, because there has been some political science literature that's talked about the effect of major sports victories on politics, presidential. If the home team wins, um, the incumbent party does see a boost historically.
Interesting.
And so it would be fascinating. I don't know how you would do it, but for a political scientist to go into New York and figure out how many votes Mamdani and the Mamdaniites won from the Knicks.
Yeah, because it was pretty close. Like they were right near each other as far as proximity goes. And you know, man, Danny, you know, there's a reason why every New Yorker was running to put on a Knicks jersey. Every New York politician was trying to put on a Knicks jersey. Many of whom probably do not understand the finer points of the game.
No, you've got to feel bad for the Nets, huh?
Yeah, right. Well, it's like 2016 in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
Everybody all of a sudden put a Cubs jersey on, and it's like, hold on a second, you got another team in
Yeah,
town, guys.
there's another baseball team
Another
right down
baseball.
the L. Yeah.
Uh, and you know
But
the team that you know, and in fact, if that happens, if one of the like let's say the major team wins in a city, the politician you need to support is the one who says, "While I am grateful that our city, you know, while I'm grateful and I'm very happy for all of the fans of that team, and I'm looking forward to the opportunities that is created for our city by this victory. I'm a White Sox fan and I'm not that happy, or I'm a Nets fan and I'm not that happy. That person is worthy of your support, folks."
absolutely. Well, except for the fact that they're a White Sox fan, and that means that they support a team playing against the Minnesota Twins in the American League Central. Um, White Sox fans in that case are evil and uh, deserve persecution. But other than that,
Or to become pope.
or to become the Pope, I suppose they are divinely ordained these days. That's a shame. We
They
need
need
to
all the
elect.
help they can get. Let's be honest.
Yeah, they do.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
we're gonna wrap it up there. We could talk endlessly, of course. But anyway, Jack, have a
Mm,
great time in Prague.
I will.
And
You have a great time in Arizona. Enjoy the beautiful weather.
will do. Thanks, Jack.